Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele, and thanks for joining us this week. Today we're thinking family systems in congregational life, and Robert Creech is with me. He's the author of this book, How Are Family Systems in Congregational Life Providing the Map for Ministry, but he's also the Professor of Pastoral Leadership at Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary in Waco, in Texas, in the US. Robert, thanks so much for coming in and talking to us. You've been doing a couple of seminars around Sydney for pastoral leaders, and a few of the people at your seminar have sent me some quotes from the last 2 days to drill down with you on.
So you're going to hold me accountable.
I am. But let's just start firstly. Many leadership books focus on laws and techniques, but how does Bowen family systems theory speak into leadership in a way that's different and distinctive to that?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the book that's called Third Way Leadership, and that's exactly what I mean, that there are those that work on techniques, and there are leadership theories that work on principles, 21 irrefutable laws of leadership or something like that.
Yep.
But Bowen theory...
You're having a shot at Robert Maxwell there.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they're helpful. They're irrefutable. So, but what I think, I can't carry 21 laws around in my head to know in a given situation what's the best thing to do. But Bowen theory has worked for me, provided for me. That's why I use the metaphor of a map. It's a way of thinking about the territory of leadership and of all pastoral ministry, really, I think, is relationships. And how we think about human behavior and human relationships makes us more flexible and nimble in a given situation. If I've got a way of thinking about it, I can maybe be helpful to the others around me as we think our way through an issue. And so third way leadership, or using Bowen theory, is about learning how human relationships work, how humans behave in relationships, and letting that guide our thinking about leading change, or the anxiety that's produced when we start talking about change or working on change in a congregation. So it's different that way. One writer in this field, Ed Friedman, said that a person working on differentiation of self, which is the project one takes on in family systems, will make any leadership theory look good. That it's about the character of the leader and the leader's capacity to think about relationships. And Bowen theory is not a leadership theory. It's about relationships and about human behavior.
Okay, so help me then to think about relationships and character and human behavior.
Yeah. Well, Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist in the States back in the second part of the 20th century, and working with patients schizophrenic patients in a hospital setting with their families present, he began to notice these regular patterns of interaction between family members and the staff on the hospital floor, and began to notice that these were consistent, and that the patients, as the family's anxiety increased, perhaps the patient's symptoms increased, and vice versa, that a calmer family, the patient's symptoms tend to diminish some. And he observed over time he developed 8 concepts that formed his theory, which he believed to be a scientific theory of human behavior, meaning not just a hunch or a way of thinking about it. He thinks this is the way humans behave. And he had tested these concepts before he ever labeled it a theory. And so one of the big terms in Bowen theory is about anxiety, that when human beings are anxious, we only have 4 things in our repertoire that we do automatically, which are: we fight, it's conflict, Bowen called it; we flee, he called that distance; we over or under function, that is, we take responsibility for somebody else's thinking, we tell people what to think, what to believe, we grab things out of their hands and do it for them, that's over functioning. Or we underfunction, we become irresponsible and let others do for us what we should be doing for ourselves when we're anxious. And the 4th one is, he called triangles or projection. We focus our attention and blame on some part of the system and say that's the problem, and everybody agrees that's the problem, and we do that when we're anxious. And so knowing that about, say, a congregation, I always thought about it as like the dashboard on my car. Is that I've got these gauges on there. You know, there's a conflict gauge and a distance gauge and a over/under functioning gauge and a triangling gauge. And at any given time, no, they're never at zero. Everybody's got a little bit of anxiety going on, and we disagree and we withdraw. And but when you start seeing one or more of the needles moving over, that's an indication that anxiety is rising in the congregation. And so it's a good thing to ask questions like, what's changed? Why is this happening today rather than last week or last month? What's my part in what's going on in the change? And what can I do differently than what I've been? So it's about taking responsibility in those systems that we're part of, whether that's our family, same gauges work in our family, our marriages, or it's our congregation.
Tell me about a couple of churches that you've spoken into that have kind of had the gauges wrong and how we've been able to help them get them better.
This was particularly helpful to me. A couple of years ago, I serve as interim pastor in congregations regularly. And about 4 years ago, I served as interim.
And you were telling me before, you're currently serving at a pastor of 800 people.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a church down in the Houston, Texas area that their senior pastor had been there almost 20 years, lacking 6 months. And he was 69 years old. And one Saturday night, he shot himself in the head. Wow. And nobody saw that coming. He was a very outgoing fellow, and they did not understand, what he was dealing with. And that was in May, the end of May, and I went in August to begin serving as interim pastor there. So to say that was an anxious congregation is an understatement. Yeah. And so I was there 18 months, but being able to, this was a really useful map to carry for me, to know I'm going to be dealing with anxious people. Anxious people get into conflict. Anxious people withdraw and become distant, drop out of church is the way it shows up in a congregation. Anxious people take over and try to run things or abdicate their responsibilities. Anxious people look for someone to blame or to point finger at. And just knowing that, going into that congregation, the goal, I think, for a leader working with this system is to be, one person put it, is like your object is to be the calmest person in the room. You don't have to be perfectly calm. There's nobody that doesn't have their own anxiety about anything. But if you can be the calmest person in the room, you're in a position to help other people think and calm down. And people do. They look to their leaders, and when they perceive that we're anxious, their anxiety shoots up. But if they're anxious and we are less so, they calm down. They look to us for that. I have a story to do. I have?
Yeah.
Okay. This is in the book, but this was one of the times it just drove this home to me about the power of being a calmer presence in an anxious system. I have no hearing in this ear, and this ear is diminished. I'm wearing a hearing device, okay? And one of the things I really have trouble hearing are high-pitched noises.
Right.
I just don't hear them. They don't register at all. And so I was preaching at our church I was pastor of a few years ago, and I was preaching from Mark 4, Jesus calming the sea. And I was preaching about fear, and Jesus says to his disciples, "Don't be afraid. Why were you so afraid? Where's your faith?" And this is the focus of the thing, is kind of escaping from fear. Well, the fire alarm went off in the building while I was preaching. Some kid had pulled the switch, and I didn't hear it.
And everyone else did.
Everyone else did. And I was watching the congregation, and you could just visibly see their anxiety. They're looking at each other and looking around. What do we do? What do we do? And I'm just going on saying, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." And then I mess with them sometimes, and they knew that. So they this is just one of those things. He's playing a recording of an alarm or something, and they all calm down. If someone had to come in from outside and come up on the platform and say, "Pastor, the fire alarm's going off, we need to evacuate." But their my calm leadership could have burned them all to a crisp. But I think that really taught me, though, that there is power in working on oneself to manage our own anxiety so that we can be present to people in a calmer way, and they can calm down and think and not be running on automatic and being conflictual and withdrawing and these other things.
What about the overfunctioning and the underfunctioning? How do we get that wrong?
Yeah, pastors are notorious overfunctioners. We want to tell people what to think. We want to tell people what to do. We want to do for them. When they're hurting, we want to move in and fix things.
Yeah.
that's a form of overfunctioning. And the idea is, how do I control myself enough, not when if there's a hurting person, their anxiety is high, I catch it, it's contagious. And my tendency might be to want to make myself feel better by taking care of them, not asking the question, what do they really need right now, and what are they capable of doing for themselves that I don't need to be doing for them. And overfunctioning leads us into that. And you have overfunctioning staff members and overfunctioning lay leaders in a congregation too, that they get anxious and they start taking over. And but it's always reciprocal. For every overfunctioner, there's an underfunctioner that they deserve. So people abdicate their responsibility while others take over during anxious times. And less anxious times, everybody's sort of playing their part. But when anxiety rises, you watch the irresponsibility and the over-responsibility sort of kick in.
What's an ideal level of anxiety to have in the church? I mean, we do want to feel like we're frustrated that we haven't succeeded in bringing the Great Commission to pass.
Anxiety is not the devil.
It
is, and I heard Murray Bowen in a videotape one time say, anxiety won't kill you. And by anxiety, he didn't mean the normal kind of nervousness that we use when we talk about anxiety or anxiety attacks. It wasn't a diagnostic thing, it's a biological thing. It's the way God made us, that when we perceive a threat, we have an automatic reaction to that. That is anxiety. Now, if the threat's real, like the building's on fire, it's an appropriate thing, it'll save our life. But when we're just living, we live in an anxious world. We watch, our anxiety is raised and our congregation's anxiety is raised when they watch news on the television. Their anxiety is coming from issues going on in their own family or maybe their work world. And so they come to church with an ambient level of anxiety all the time. And we have one, in our families, in our work world. And so that's called, he called that chronic anxiety. And that's really the culprit, is it makes us susceptible to these automatic reactions of conflict and distance and over and under functioning. But anxiety is not the devil. It's the thing that, it's facing challenge is how we grow. And anytime we introduce change to a congregation, the slightest thing, we know ahead of time we're going to raise the level of anxiety. People get anxious when they're asked to change, because that often means they're going to be asked to give up something they've grown accustomed to.
Well, I'll give you my one from this month.
Sure.
You can unpack me. In our church, we've got a gift and pledge day coming up on the 10th of November.
And everybody knows it.
Everyone knows it, and we're asking everyone to put in a form, and 3 days later our parish council will meet, and depending on what forms come in, we'll be able to do the new programs or not do the new programs, and so everything's up for grabs.
Right.
And so this is the moment of the year where I feel I'm anxious, people are anxious, I feel we're susceptible to spiritual attack, do you know?
Yeah.
And I don't think you're saying that's unhealthy, though.
It's normal. It's just the way humans are. This is why it's a kind of map for me. It helps me understand and cut people a little bit of slack.
Yeah.
Because people don't behave at their best, none of us, when we're running on automatic.
Yeah.
Tell you another story that this was a good day for me. This isn't something I'm able to pull off all the time, because I have my own anxiety and the pressures, the relationship pressures of wanting to please people and people to be happy and the budget to be made. But I had been studying this and using this for some years before I was able to get this right on one day. I wish I had 30 stories like this, but I only got 2. So it was a good day. But a senior adult man came to visit me in my office, and he was a good friend and a very good supporter, and he was concerned for me. He was visibly anxious when he came in the room. I mean, like hand-wringing anxious. And he said, I've got to tell you what's going on among our senior adults. He said, they're saying some awful things about you. I said, and I've been their pastor for 15 years at that point. It's like, well, like, what's going on, Frank? And he said, well, they're saying you don't believe in Jesus, that you don't believe people need to trust Jesus to be saved. And, well, that tipped me off. When he said that, that tells me that whatever else is going on, it's not about what it's about.
Right.
Because my Christology or soteriology had not changed
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
And so if that's the rumor circulating, then there's something else going on.
Yeah.
So that was, fortunately, I was alerted. In an earlier version of myself, I would have said, give me their names and I'll find them and go talk to them and convince them that I'm Orthodox.
That's right.
And that would have been just squashing the symptom down,
Yeah.
but not dealing with the anxiety. So we had a staff member retire. The church was 28 years old at the time, and he had been there 26 years. And he had walked alongside most of these seniors,
Yeah.
adults, and now he was gone. And I had anticipated that his departure would have some effect on our congregational system. I just couldn't predict what it would be. And in that moment, it sort of came to me, I think this has to do with his retirement. I think they're anxious that there's nobody in the staff meetings who has their back, that they're not as confident that their pastors care for them and will be thinking about them as they were when he was present, because he was sort of one of them. And so that thought came to me, I said to Frank, I said, I think, let's run an experiment. I think that these folks are concerned about whether or not their pastors care for them. And I did. These were dear people. I'd been their pastor for 15 years. And they weren't behaving at their best right now.
Yeah.
Okay. But I said, let's run an experiment. I think that if I'll go down and have coffee with them we had 2 worship services and their group met in between that.
Yeah.
If I'll go down between services and have coffee with them and talk to them about their grandchildren and my grandchildren and fishing and other things, I think I'll be Orthodox in a month. and he said, really? I said, yeah, don't tell anybody. Let's just see what happens. And sure enough, now, to be honest, my stomach was in a knot. I don't like having people saying bad things about me, particularly that I've become unorthodox. And so I had to screw up my courage and go lean into that and go down there. And I did.
And not talk about Christology
and not,
talk
exactly,
about fishing.
Just talk about the things I knew that were their life and my life. And they calmed down. They knew their pastors cared for them. Now, I could have preached a sermon about gossip. I could have done a variety of things. It would have been reactive, automatic on my part, kind of conflictual. Or I could have withdrawn from them and become distant and said, I'm not having anything to do with people that treat me like that. But it took, screwing up your courage to go down there and then not to avoid them in the hallway when you see them, but to walk over toward them and increasing contact with them. And sure enough, it just went away. It was never a discussion. And I did conducted a wedding for the grandchild of one of the key ringleaders in that group a few weeks later, and he was just over the top pleased. He was the fisherman that I was talking about. I didn't need to be told who was saying this. I kind of knew who these people might be. But that's an example
But that's actually a parable of what all of us deal with all the time.
Right.
Yeah. And it might be on a slightly smaller scale, but that's pretty much, I mean, I'm sure you've told that story and some others have come up and said, that rings a bell.
Yes, exactly. And so, when you're doing a pledge campaign for your budget and your programs, you should anticipate that there are going to be some people that are more conflictual than usual, or some people that sort of back off, or people become overly responsible or irresponsible. And to know that, it's not like that makes their behavior okay. They still got to deal with that, but I can give them a little grace and say, this is just an anxious time, and people don't behave their best during anxious times, not me and not them. And so the perspective, the map, that's where it sort of helped me out.
Very interesting,
But I have more stories that have to do with where I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and I just contributed to the anxiety.
Well, tell us one of those.
Well, that was, okay. Like pretty early on in my tenure there, we were making some pretty significant changes as far as that congregation is concerned. It had been a pretty traditional Baptist congregation. And one of the things Baptists traditionally did in Texas was a Sunday evening service. Mm-hmm. But our community wasn't a very traditional community. There were a lot of young adults in there. They'd come from other parts of the country. Sunday evening was pretty much the beginning of their work week. They were getting kids ready for school, and people were getting ready for business trips and whatever. And they just were not attending the Sunday evening service. Yeah. We'd have 1,000 people in 2 services or 3 services in the morning, but not anybody showing up on Sunday night except the senior adults, a handful. And I was preparing a separate message for that and doing that, and we had started a Saturday night worship service, and our staff just came to say, we don't think this is a good use of our time and energy to do this service that 25 people are showing up, and
we're getting 400 in the morning.
And 900 people are voting no. So we started a process to change that, and that erupted some anxiety on the part of those seniors. And one of them, he had more, and I didn't know this, understand this at the time, I knew it. And I tried to be a pastor to him, but not at the level he needed. I understand that now. He had had 2 heart attacks and had open heart surgery over the past several years, and I've been present for that. He had to lay off a number of people at his business where he was a vice president of a pretty large organization there. He had had a son in the first Gulf War, and he had a daughter who had twin preschoolers, and the mom was a drug addict, and he and his wife were taking these 2 preschoolers in. The anxiety of their life was coming from every direction, is the point. And so he became rather belligerent about this change and called a meeting at his home to discuss this, and didn't invite me, and I found out about it and wormed my way into it, and I went to his house for that meeting. I thought there would be 80 angry people there. There were 4 couples there.
Yeah.
And all I could do, because I didn't have any of this in my head, was to try to answer their questions and talk about the content. That's like going to defend your orthodoxy.
Yeah.
I didn't understand that this was being driven by other forces, and if I could have been a better pastor to him, and I was at his house to pray for him when his son got deployed. I went over when the kids came over, but it didn't need more than that. I was 35 years old. I didn't have a clue what it would be like to be, 60 and having your world look like this.
Yeah.
And I later went back to him and his wife years later and said, if I had been a more emotionally mature pastor, I think you could have stayed. He left the church.
Right.
You could have stayed connected with your church. And he said, yeah, well, if I'd been a more emotionally mature deacon, I'd have found a way to stay connected. But that would, that would be very typical behavior for me. I find out somebody's got an issue, and I go try to talk to them about the issue and ignore what's going on below the surface, which is the driving force of the anxiety. And I could have been a better pastor had I paid attention to that. And he probably wouldn't have called the meeting. We would have probably ended up having coffee and talking about something instead of his kind of overreacting to a change like that.
How do I get to be like the guy in your first story and less like the guy in your second story?
I'll just say this. I wish I'd read that book when I was 35 years old,
right.
But I couldn't. Bowen theory has been a helpful tool for me to try to understand, both in my family and in the congregation, how to on a good day be a less anxious person and therefore a little more of a help to those around me as well.
Now, a couple of quotes from your people listening to you the last 2 days. The preacher is vulnerable in the battle between pastoral affection versus prophetic courage. What do you mean by that?
Well, we who preach, we don't preach to unknown people. We preach to people that over time we come to love very much. Paul's word in Philippians, it's right for me to feel this way about you because I have you in my heart. You know this from being here for quite a while. At first, you've got a room full of strangers, but eventually...
I remember the first sermon I preached here. I gave a talk that I'd done about 6 times before. It was on the Psalm 23, and I knew it was a good talk. And I came here, and they didn't really want me, and it was like preaching to the woodstack.
But last Sunday was it?
Not at all.
Yeah. So we build relationships with these people. They become dear to us. They should. I think the idea of being a pastor and having no affection for the people you serve, even the ones that are a little cantankerous.
Yeah.
They're our brothers and sisters, and that's almost not a deep enough word in some ways. So that makes us vulnerable, is we want them to be pleased. We want them to be happy with us. There's that. We don't like displeasing people that we care about. And yet if we're called on to speak a word to them that is hard, we may shy away from that. That's where the tension between prophetic courage to speak that word and pastoral affection form a tension. And that puts relationship pressure on us. And we may compromise at that point and refuse to speak that word because of the affection that we have. And that's where what I was talking about, this tension we live in of how do you speak the truth in love and be heard?
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, as you say that, I'm thinking back. We've had one really big anxious season in my time here, and I'd been sued in the Supreme Court, and we'd just done a building program, and we had some people in church who were unhappy with me, and I remember then looking at the passage and really becoming totally unsure about the application, and really feeling that tension then. Whereas now, we're not in a very anxious time in our church, and things are going, apart from this little moment. But actually, there's much. It's much easier to be vulnerable about my own weaknesses, and much easier to speak prophetically into their lives. Yeah.
Well, and I think over time, when they do trust you, and the affection is mutual, but the prophetic word that comes at that time when you have to say the hard thing, you don't say it. There's a degree of brokenness and vulnerability with which you say it. The Old Testament prophets did not seem to take any joy at the message they had to deliver to their people. They delivered it, but it was with a broken heart. And preachers who seem to take some delight in bringing the prophetic word. They may do well on the prophetic courage, but I'm wondering about the pastoral affection. Finding a way to deliver those words with some vulnerability and recognizing that not only is this word to you, it's to me also. I stand under this word also. I have to, I'm accountable to this message as much as you are. And I'm complicit often in the very things we're addressing. That can be heard as a prophetic word without it becoming a hammer that we're there to smash people with.
So I don't have a particular difficulty being vulnerable now, but I did have a difficulty being vulnerable when people were really cross with me, and there was a high level of anxiety and conflict in our church a decade ago. How do you help a minister be vulnerable at those moments?
I think that takes probably more emotional maturity than most of us carry around in our head, and because we are not likely to be vulnerable with people we don't trust.
Don't feel safe with. If I don't feel safe in the pulpit, how can I?
You can. The idea that often surfaces in Bowen theory is that the work that we do is not on them; it's on ourselves. Now, the fact that we feel automatically unsafe with them may or may not be a fact. I mean, the unsafeness, insecurity, whatever, may not be a fact. It's a fact we feel that way. It may not be a fact that we are in truth threatened.
Unsafe,
And so it might be working on ourselves a bit to say, is there really a threat here? What's the worst they could do to me? And perhaps being vulnerable with them is a move toward them and leaning into the relationship, and it will require something on my part that is overcoming that automatic tendency to want to put a wall up or back off. And so I grow in that process, and I'll see what happens to them. I can't predict, and I don't do this to manipulate them. I do this to grow myself. But nearly always, what you say to somebody who's up against a challenge like that is work on yourself. And if it, you pray and you move into the thing that is hard, and maybe you only take a little step into it, but shying away from it, that's that automatic responsive distance. So our tendency is, that's threatening, I need to get away from it, rather than it feels threatening. It's probably not as threatening as I'm describing it in my head. I need to lean into it, and in the process of doing that, God grows me a little bit more maturity. The place where one does this most work on what Bowen called differentiation or emotional maturity is in our own family of origin, with our own parents. It's like Frodo with the ring. You got to go back to Mount Doom. That's where this was all forged. And so we go back to our own family and work on understanding what we've received from them, how we learned emotional reactivity from our family, Families teach us how safe the world is or how threatening it is, and we go back to our own parents if they're still alive, and we work on our relationship with them of being an adult in their presence, not to fix them, but just this very thing of leaning into the hard thing, and in the process we grow a bit. And it's a project. It's not something one does over a weekend at a retreat or read a book and I got this now. It's a project for life of seeking to become more emotionally mature, less reactive, better able to think during when intensity is high. And if we do that, both our family and our congregations benefit greatly from having somebody in the midst of them who's working on that.
Yeah. Winning friends versus goal-directed activity and emotionally mature and immature.
When Bowen tries to describe, he used this term differentiation of self to just recognizing that that people vary in their ability to handle intense anxiety. Some people don't handle that well at all. They become very symptomatic very quickly. And other people, a little more what he called emotionally mature, have learned to manage more anxiety. And when he describes people at various, he talks about people, he had an arbitrary scale from 0 to 100. No way to test and find out where you are on there or anything like that. But he tried to describe that variability by saying people, say from 0 to 25, tend to behave this way in relationships. And people from 25 to 50, which is where he thought most of us were, below 50, tend to behave this way. And one of the things he said is that the lower we are on the scale, the more we're concerned about approval from others and meeting their expectations and winning friends, and the affection part of that tension would win out over goal-directed activity of saying, this is what I believe, this is what I'm called to do, this is what, as a leader, I believe we're called to do, and staying focused on that goal-directed activity. We will sacrifice our principles for the relationships, the less mature we are. And so that's kind of where that was coming from. I think that was some of Bowen's words.
Now, each week on The Pastor's Heart, we ask our guest what God has been doing on your heart. And maybe you could share a little of that. Yeah.
Sure. I have I was a pastor for 22 years, and for the last 11 years I've been teaching ministry students. And I think one of the things that more and more has been growing in me, I said this to my class before I left last week. We had just finished reading a book together, Todd Bolsinger's book called Canoeing the Mountains, and about leading change off the map when in a post-Christendom world. And, but we were talking to them very honestly about, I really wish my generation had left you a better world to work with, but you're the ones that God has called right now to go off the map and lead the church into places it's not been before. And one of the things that's just been stirring in me is how faithful God has been to call these young men and women into ministry and to have this opportunity to invest in them at this time in my life. And it's just such a privilege to do that. And it's been humbling to me. That's the thing I think the Lord's been doing mostly, is to say, this is a thing bigger than you that you get to do. And it's a real privilege to be investing in them, knowing that they've got 30 years of ministry, 40 years of ministry in front of them in a world that's going crazy right now. And that in which the model of church that I grew up serving in is probably not going to be what they end up doing.
Working in,
But and there's no way to tell, that the old thing that I've heard this so many times, they didn't teach me that in seminary or at Bible college. Yeah, if we'd kept you 40 years, we could have taught you everything. But what we have to give you is a way of thinking into the future. And that's where, our theology does that. That's where I think some of those practical courses we take in school is biblical studies and theological studies, because that's how we're going to think our way forward. And having maps like this help that. But I think that's the thing God's been really working in me, is just who these people are that I stand in front of every week. They're not just students. This is the church's future, or one little piece of it. And to get to be with them for 3 years in their life is a pretty big privilege.
Yeah. Robert, thanks so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Well, it's been helpful for me. It's given me quite a bit to think about. Yeah. Robert Creech has been my guest. Family Systems and Congregational Life, A Map for Ministry is the book, and you can get it from the Wondering bookseller, but Amazon, all those kind of places. And we've been very pleased to have Robert, and looking forward to seeing you next week on The Pastor's Heart.